He looked like a ghost, walking where the living still dared to breathe. 20 winters had passed since Thaddius Crane last spoke to another soul. 20 years since his hands had touched another human being. And yet here he was, standing in a pine clearing, staring at a woman tied to a tree, bleeding into the frost-covered earth. Now let me ask you something. What would make a man disappear for 2 decades? And what would make him come back? Because this story, it isn't about bandits or bullets, not really. It's about a broken man who chose silence over pain, who buried his name so deep in the mountains, not even time could find it. Until one morning, a pair of green eyes opened in the snow, and everything he thought he'd forgotten came rushing back. This story is about how guilt can bury you alive, and how courage can dig you out. It's about a woman who was never the victim she seemed to be, and a man who discovered he might still have something left to fight for. Stay with me, because by the time this tale ends, you'll see what happens when a ghost chooses to live again. And just maybe, you'll start to believe that no matter how far we run, we are never too lost to be found. There are men who vanish from the world not because they die, but because living becomes too heavy. Thaddius Crane was one of those men. The mountain didn't ask questions. It didn't care that Thaddius had once been a husband, a man with a name that carried weight. It only knew him as a shadow among the pines. In those high, snow-laced ridges, where the wind howled like old regrets, he found what he thought was peace. But peace built on fear isn't peace at all. It's just exile with a softer name. His days were quiet and measured. Chop wood, boil water, mend the roof, watch the seasons roll in like tides of memory. No one visited. No one even knew he was still alive. He hadn't seen his own reflection in years, didn't need to. The man he used to be no longer lived inside his skin. But the silence, that was the hardest part. It crept into his bones. At night, when the fire died down and the cold settled in, it wasn't the wolves that haunted him. It was the voice of a woman named Sarah. Her laughter, her final scream. The memory played over and over like the scratch of a needle stuck in the groove of an old song. He told himself he was atoning, that staying away from people was the only way to keep anyone else from getting hurt. But deep down, he knew the truth. He wasn't protecting the world from himself. He was protecting himself from ever caring again. That morning, like so many before, he packed lightly. Twice a year, he descended the winding trails into the lowlands to gather supplies. The rest of the year, he made do. That was his rhythm. Predictable. Safe. But that day, the pines didn't feel right. The air was too still. The birds too quiet. And as he neared the old clearing, where the trading post had once stood, something twisted in his gut. The kind of instinct that comes not from fear, but from the long-forgotten whisper of duty. He stepped into the clearing and saw her. A woman tied to the oak, blood staining her temple, a torn dress fluttering in the cold breeze. And just like that, the walls he'd built for 20 years began to shift. His boots sank into the frost-covered earth as he took a step forward. Just one, then another. Because what Thaddius Crane didn't know yet was that the moment he saw her eyes open, that moment would be the beginning of everything. And in part 2, the silence he clung to will be shattered by the sound of a whisper. Just one word that will force him to choose between the safety of his shadows and the storm of the past waiting to claim him. She looked like a fallen bird, tangled, torn, and out of place against the bark of that old oak. Thick rope bit into her wrists, and blood darkened one side of her face, painting her hair a deeper black. Her dress hung in tatters, one shoulder bare to the cold. But she was breathing. Barely. Thaddius Crane stopped dead in his tracks. This was exactly the kind of thing he'd spent 20 years avoiding. The kind of moment that pulled you in with invisible threads that asked for something more than just being a witness. And he couldn't afford that kind of vulnerability. Not again. His fingers clenched and unclenched at his sides. He looked at her, then at the path that led away, back toward the woods, back toward the safe silence that had been his prison and his shelter. He could walk away. No one would know. No one would blame him, except himself. Her head lolled forward, and for a second he thought she was gone. But then her lashes fluttered and her eyes greened fierce, even through the haze locked with his. Something unspoken passed between them. Not a plea, not even desperation, just hope, fragile and foolish like a candle flickering in the wind. He felt it then. The walls he'd built crack not from guilt or fear, but from the simple recognition that someone still believed help could come. The rope was tight, hardened by cold and soaked with her blood. His hands shook as he reached out, touched the fibers. It had been so long since he'd touched another person. The feel of her skin as he steadied her, it jolted him like he'd stepped into sunlight after too many years underground. "Please," she whispered, voice raw. "They'll be back." They went to get more rope. That phrase, more rope, landed in his gut like a punch. These weren't just raiders who'd moved on. Whoever had done this planned to return. And now Thaddius was standing at the center of a storm that had only just begun to gather. He hesitated. One final moment of choice. He could run and disappear again. But if he did, it would mean watching another woman suffer, maybe die because he didn't act. He'd lived with that weight once already, and it had crushed him for 2 decades. So he stayed. His fingers found the knots, worked them. His breath fogged in the air, mingling with hers. And when the last loop came free, and her weight slumped forward into his arms, he caught her not just with his body, but with something he thought he no longer had. The ability to care. But the forest wasn't silent anymore. Hoofbeats, laughter, the past was coming riding fast. And in part 3, the name of the man who destroyed Thaddius's life will echo through the clearing once more. A name he thought he'd buried forever, now spoken by the woman he just saved. It started as a murmur in the trees, hoofbeats, faint at first. Then louder, fast, urgent. The kind of sound that didn't belong in the hush of a mountain morning. The kind that said, danger doesn't knock out here. It rides. Thaddius's body went still. Every muscle coiled tight as a snare. His eyes scanned the tree line, his breath steady but shallow. In his arms, the woman stirred, her face pressed against his chest, her voice a ragged whisper. "They'll be back. They're coming." Thaddius didn't need her to say more. He already knew. The men who had tied her, left her, who planned to return with more rope, weren't strangers. He could feel it. A heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with memory. And then she said it. Just one name. Hayes. The sound of it opened something raw in him, like ripping the scab off a wound that never fully healed. Clayton Hayes, the devil in a black hat, the man who'd smiled while Thaddius's world burned. Thaddius had spent 2 decades trying to forget that name. But Hayes hadn't forgotten him. He placed the woman gently on her feet, steadying her. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded barely. "I think so. My name's Eleanor Harper." He didn't give his name in return. Names were roots, and roots could be pulled. Branches cracked in the distance. Then, like ghosts from a shared nightmare, they rode into view, 4 of them. Rough-armed, the kind of men who had no need for law except to break it. And leading them, tall in the saddle with cold eyes that hadn't changed a bit, was Clayton Hayes. Thaddius recognized him instantly. The way he held himself, the quiet menace in every movement. He hadn't aged much. Maybe a little gray in the beard, but the cruelty in his smile was untouched by time. "Well, I'll be damned," Hayes called out, his voice slicing through the clearing like a knife. "Thaddius Crane, I was beginning to wonder if you'd already put a bullet in your own skull. Guess the mountain didn't eat you after all." Thaddius said nothing. He stepped forward just slightly enough to place himself between Hayes and Eleanor. Her hand gripped his arm. He could feel the tremble in her. But she didn't hide behind him. There was steel in her spine despite the blood and bruises. Hayes dismounted slowly, his spurs singing with each step. The other 3 formed a loose circle, hands resting casually on the grips of their guns. "You're still playing hero." "I see," Hayes sneered. "Haven't learned your lesson after what happened to Sarah." And just like that, the past wasn't memory anymore. It was standing in front of him, armed, smirking. In part 4, secrets buried in blood will claw their way back into the light. And Eleanor's quiet strength will challenge the only thing Thaddius has trusted for 20 years, his fear. The first gunshot didn't even sound real, not at first. Just a sharp crack in the cold morning air like a tree branch snapping under ice. But then came the shouting, the stomping of hooves, and the unmistakable voice of Hayes barking orders. "Don't kill him! I want them alive!" Thaddius didn't wait. He didn't plan, didn't hesitate. One arm wrapped around Eleanor's waist, the other pushing branches aside as they tore into the underbrush behind the oak. Bullets snapped through the air behind them, carving splinters from trunks and bark. He didn't look back. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because he knew what he'd see, the past riding hard on their heels. They ran like hunted things stumbling through brush and frost, each breath a knife in the lungs. Eleanor was fast, but she was bleeding, and her steps faltered more than once. Thaddius guided her through the forest like a man remembering how to lead again, how to protect again. Somewhere behind them, Hayes's men were spreading out, calling to each other in harsh tones, tightening the noose. They reached a low ridge where a fallen log offered brief shelter. Thaddius pulled her down behind it, heart pounding. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tight against pain. "I can keep going," she said before he even asked, though her body shook with every breath. "But if you think we can outrun Hayes..." "You don't know men like him." Thaddius did. All too well. Hayes wasn't chasing them out of vengeance. He was hunting them with purpose, the same way he'd done everything with a plan and patience sharpened into cruelty. "There's a place," Thaddius said, his voice hoarse. "A cabin. Hidden. Defensible. 3 miles up the mountain. Then we go?" Eleanor answered. "Dangerous or not." But before they could rise again, she reached out and caught his arm. "What happened to Sarah?" she asked softly. The name hit him like ice water. No one had spoken it in 20 years, not even he. For a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. But her green eyes held his steady open, not judging, just asking for the truth. "She was my wife." He said the words gravel in his throat. "Hayes used her. As bait. Said if I gave him what he wanted, he'd let her go. I believed him. And he didn't. He shot her in front of me," Thaddius whispered. "Just to prove I was a fool." Eleanor was quiet for a long breath, then said simply, "I'm not her. And this isn't 20 years ago." He looked at her, truly looked, and for the first time saw someone who didn't need saving, someone who chose to stand, despite the pain, despite the fear. From somewhere behind them, a branch snapped. "They're close," he said. "We move now. Stay behind me. Step where I step. Don't look back." But as they prepare to move, Eleanor stops him with one last truth, and what she reveals next will turn everything Thaddius thought he knew into a lie, carefully constructed by fate itself. In Part 5, the hunter and the hunted will trade places, and trust will become the only weapon that matters. They crouched in the hush beneath the pine's breath, clouding in the cold as the world around them narrowed to 2 hearts beating too fast and a truth too long buried. Thaddius had told the story 100 times in his own mind, always the same. Sarah died because he hesitated, because he believed in mercy when the moment demanded steel, and because he loved her too much to imagine she'd ever be used as a weapon. Hayes made sure of that. She was strong, he said, staring at the ground as if it could explain something the sky never had. Gentle but smart. She saw something she wasn't supposed to. Got too close to what Hayes was doing, his roots, his buyers, the money trails. She was just trying to help. And I thought I could outplay him. That if I cooperated, gave Hayes what he wanted, I could save her and still keep my hands clean. His voice caught there. He didn't need to say what came next. Eleanor had already guessed it. He killed her anyway, she said, not as a question, but as a confirmation of what kind of man Hayes truly was. Thaddius nodded slowly. "I carried her body into the pines, dug her grave with my bare hands. I didn't speak another word for months. Just disappeared." Eleanor didn't flinch, didn't pity him. She only placed a hand on his forearm, steady, warm, real. "I'm not Sarah," she said again, gently but firmly. "And I didn't come out here to die. I came out here to end this." He looked at her, something shifting behind his eyes. A man who'd lived too long in the echo of a scream. I need to tell you something. She continued, her voice low but urgent. Why Hayes took me. It wasn't random. The wind rustled through the trees, and somewhere behind them, another voice called out, distant but closing. Time was short, but Thaddius could see it in her eyes. This couldn't wait. My real name isn't Eleanor Harper, she said. It's Eleanor Blackwood. Judge Marcus Blackwood was my father. It hit him like a thunderclap. Blackwood, the judge who'd tried to bring law to the lawless, who stood against Hayes when few dared, who disappeared under mysterious circumstances just months after Sarah's death. I've been tracking Hayes for 6 years, she went on. Gathering evidence, building a case. I let him take me. To get close, to finish what my father started. Thaddius stared at her, the weight of her truth colliding with his own. She wasn't the victim. She was the trap. So, I was just bait, he asked barely above a whisper. You were supposed to be, she said honestly. But then you showed up. And you didn't run. You saved me. You didn't play the part Hayes wrote for you. He swallowed hard. The guilt, the grief it had shaped him for so long. But now, a new shape was forming. Something sharper, something alive. And in part 6, the lines between hero and pawn begin to blur as Thaddius realizes the truth about Sarah's death isn't what he believed. And the key to justice might lie in trusting the one person he never meant to find. For a long moment, Thaddius just stared at her. This woman, who wasn't who she said she was, who'd carried a name not to deceive him, but to survive the role she had chosen to play. Eleanor Blackwood, daughter of the man Hayes had once feared most. And now, it seemed the last spark of a legacy built on justice in a land where justice had long since gone silent. You let him take you, he said finally, his voice rough. On purpose. She nodded. I had to. Hayes never trusts new faces unless he thinks they're powerless. I let myself be seen, let him believe I was vulnerable. I needed him close, and there's only one way a man like Hayes lets a woman that close. As bait, there was no bitterness in her tone, only steel. Thaddius felt something twist inside him. Not anger, not betrayal, but recognition. He had lived 20 years running from the weight of his own choices, while this woman, this stranger, had walked directly into the storm he'd spent 2 decades avoiding. Didn't count on me showing up, he murmured. No, she said softly. That wasn't part of the plan. He could hear the rustling of men in the woods now, closer again. The chase wasn't over. But something had shifted. The girl tied to the oak had vanished. In her place stood a woman who had spent 6 years preparing for this very moment. I hid the evidence, she said. It's in my saddle pack maps, names, shipment ledgers, enough to take down Hayes and half the men feeding off this territory. Then we go after it, he said, already rising. But she caught his wrist. Thaddius, there's more. She hesitated, and in her hesitation, he saw it, that fragile thing even the strongest carried out. I found something. About Sarah, she said quietly. While I was digging into Hayes's past, I found records. Notes, letters. Sarah didn't just die because she was leverage against you. She died because she discovered something about Hayes's operation, something dangerous, something she wasn't supposed to know. The words felt like stones dropped into still water. Thaddius's mind reeled. You mean? It wasn't my fault, he asked, more to himself than to her. Eleanor met his gaze. She died doing what you believed in. She wasn't a victim of your mistake, Thaddius. She was a casualty of her own courage. It should have felt like a relief. Instead, it felt like grief cracking open all over again, sharper now. But cleaner, honest. He hadn't failed her. He just hadn't known. A gunshot cracked in the distance. A shout followed closer this time. They're tracking us, Eleanor said, already moving. Thaddius stood, his body aching, but his heart steady in a way it hadn't been for 20 years. Then let them come, he said. But we're not running to hide anymore. We're running towards something. And in part 7, justice sharpens its teeth as Thaddius and Eleanor turn from prey to predator and prepare to face the men who've been hunting them one final time. The clearing looked different now. The old oak still stood where Eleanor had been tied, but the space around it felt tighter somehow, like the air itself remembered the violence it had almost witnessed. Hayes was back circling like a wolf who'd tasted blood and wanted more. His men had scattered to form a perimeter. The horses snorted restless. Something was about to break. And Thaddius Crane walked straight into it with his hands raised and his heart armored in resolve. "You want me, Hayes?" he called across the clearing. "Here I am. Let's finish what we started 20 years ago." Hayes straightened in his saddle, disbelief flickering across his face. Well, look who found his voice again. But I gotta say, Crane walking into my fire like this, that's not bravery, that's suicide. But Thaddius didn't stop. Each step was deliberate, slow, like a man placing his own soul on the table, daring the devil to fold. "I'm not here to fight," he said. "I'm here to talk. Because you're right, I've been hiding. But not from you, from what I know." Hayes's smirk faltered just a hair. "I remember more than you think," Thaddius went on. "I remember Sarah's last words. I remember the names she whispered. I remember what she found, the records, the shipments, the ledgers, everything she died for. It was a lie, a desperate, hollow bluff. But Hayes didn't know that. His face drained of color. "You're bluffing," he growled. Thaddius tilted his head like a man who had nothing left to lose. "Am I? You tell me. Why else would you spend 20 years chasing a ghost, unless you were afraid of what he might say?" Behind a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, Eleanor crouched, watching. She understood what Thaddius was doing. He wasn't just buying time. He was luring Hayes into the open, with truth wrapped in just enough fiction to sting. Hayes dismounted, slow and angry. "I should have finished you when I had the chance." "You did?" Thaddius replied quietly. "You killed everything I was. But you didn't bury the part that remembers." Hayes's jaw tightened. He reached for his gun, and that's when Eleanor made her move. One clean shot from the derringer she'd hidden dropped one of Hayes's riflemen where he stood. Chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked. Men shouted. But Thaddius didn't flinch. He dove for Hayes, tackling him to the ground just as the outlaw raised his weapon. Fists flew, boots scraped dirt. Old bones strained with 20 years of rage. But Hayes was younger, meaner, and he didn't hesitate. He threw Thaddius off, scrambled toward his fallen gun, until a second shot rang out. Not from Eleanor, not from any rifleman, but from the very edge of the clearing, where truth sometimes hides behind trees. And in Part 8, the tides will turn, and a revelation from an unexpected source will tip the scales of justice for good, because even devils can be outplayed when ghosts stop running. The forest exploded in sound gunfire, shouts, the panicked screech of horses pulling at their reins. The clearing just moments ago, a chessboard of tension, was now chaos in motion. Hayes scrambled for his fallen weapon, blood streaking his face, and Thaddius lay sprawled in the dirt chest, heaving, heart-pounding like war drums. But it wasn't Hayes he looked to. It was Eleanor. She was pinned behind a log, the derringer now useless out of shots. 2 riflemen had taken cover across from her, their muzzles trained ready. She'd bought them precious seconds, but seconds weren't enough. Then Thaddius saw it. Her saddle pack, hanging off the closest horse just 20 yards away. Inside was everything: ledgers, names, proof. The evidence that could finally bring Hayes down, not just for Sarah, but for everything. His breath caught in his throat. He could reach it. If he moved now, if he ran while Hayes was stunned and the gunman focused on her, he could grab it, secure the proof, end this. But he also knew if he ran for the evidence, he'd leave her exposed. And if those rifles fired, if even one bullet found her, she would die. Again. Like Sarah. The memory surged like fire through his veins. Sarah screaming, Sarah falling, Sarah left alone while he bargained with a monster who never intended to keep his word. For 20 years, that moment had defined him. A man paralyzed between 2 impossible choices. But this time he moved without hesitation, not toward the saddle pack, toward her. He ran fast, and reckless bullets tearing through the brush around him. He dove behind the log, covering Eleanor's body with his own. She looked up at him in shock, Then something softer, deeper understanding. "You should have gone for the proof," she whispered. "No," he said, his voice low, fierce. "I've lived with one death I couldn't stop. I won't live with another." She blinked hard, swallowed, and then something changed in her eyes. "I've got a plan," she said. Of course she did. Thaddius smiled, tight, tired, but real. Behind them, Hayes had recovered. He staggered to his feet, blood on his shirt, fury in his eyes. "You don't learn, Crane," he shouted. "You never learn." But Thaddius had learned. He'd learned that proof didn't matter if there was no one left to carry it. And real love, even when it was just beginning, meant choosing a life over a ledger. And in Part 9, the final move is played. Because while Hayes thinks he's still in control, a confession is coming, one born, not from violence, but from the truth he never meant to say out loud. The clearing burned with tension. Smoke drifted from the mouths of spent rifles. One of Hayes's men lay groaning in the underbrush, and the others had fled into the trees, leaving their leader behind, alone, wounded, cornered. Thaddius stood over him, chest rising with labored breath, shirt torn, blood on his knuckles. Eleanor leaned against the oak, her face pale, her strength nearly spent, but her grip still firm on the rifle she'd scavenged. And Hayes sat in the dirt, hand pressed against the wound in his shoulder, hate simmering in his eyes. "Finish it," he rasped, looking up at Thaddius. "You've got every right." But Thaddius didn't move. Not toward the gun, not toward vengeance. "I'm not here to kill you," he said. "I'm here to watch you fall the way you feared most, exposed, powerless, and remembered not as a terror, but a coward." Hayes barked a bitter laugh. "Think justice cares about words, about what you say?" I don't need to say it," Eleanor said from behind him, lifting a small device from her torn dress, a recorder. Its tiny red light blinking. "You already did?" Hayes's eyes went wide. "I caught every word," she said, voice steady. "About Sarah, about my father, about how you got there before she died. You gave yourself away, Hayes, and now the whole territory will hear it." His face collapsed into something between rage and disbelief. "You think anyone will believe that? A recording from some girl with a vendetta?" Eleanor stepped forward, slow but certain. "I'm not just some girl. I'm Judge Blackwood's daughter, and your confession combined with the ledgers in my saddle pack is enough to bury you for good." Hayes looked from her to Thaddius, and something inside him cracked. For 2 decades he'd hunted a ghost, tormented by the fear that the truth might resurface. And now it had a face. 2 of them. He dropped his head back against the tree with a long, ragged breath. "I should have killed you both when I had the chance, but you didn't," Thaddius said softly. "And now the reckoning's here." Hayes said nothing more. The fire was gone from his eyes. And for the first time in 20 years, Thaddius felt the weight of Sarah's death shift, not erased, but no longer pressing down like a stone tied to his soul. Eleanor moved beside him. Her hand slipped into his, not out of necessity, but choice. He didn't pull away. As the sun rose higher through the branches, golden light spilled across the forest floor. The ghost in the pines was no longer hiding. Justice had a voice. And this time it was loud enough for the world to hear. And in Part 10, the long silence ends where it began, with one man's choice to return not just to the world, but to himself. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to fight. It's to stay. 6 months later, the gallows stood quiet beneath the morning sky, a stark silhouette against the rising sun. Clayton Hayes was hanged for murder, conspiracy, and corruption so deep it had poisoned half the territory. His final words were bitter, but the silence that followed felt clean, honest, long overdue. Thaddius Crane stood at the back of the crowd, at low, hands clasped. He didn't come for revenge. He came to say goodbye not to Hayes, but to the part of himself that had once believed justice died with Sarah. Beside him stood Eleanor Blackwood, no longer just a shadow of her father's legacy, but a name spoken with respect across the region. Her evidence had brought down more than Hayes it had exposed: judges, marshals, trade, bosses. She didn't seek applause. She sought restoration. And in doing so, she gave Thaddius something he never thought he'd feel again. a future. After the trial, he had a choice. The mountain still waited for him. His cabin untouched, his tools still sharp, the silence still cold and familiar. But this time, when he looked toward the trees, he didn't feel peace. He felt absence. He felt alone. So he stayed. Built a small house near the edge of town, close enough to see the lantern flicker in Eleanor's window when the nights grew long. He still went up the mountain, sometimes chopping wood, setting traps. But he always came back down, always returned. Because the difference between solitude and exile is whether someone's waiting for you. They never spoke of love, not directly. But when she leaned against his shoulder by the fire, or when her hand brushed his in the courthouse, there was no need. Some bonds are quieter than words. Some healing doesn't announce itself. It just shows up steady and sure, like spring after a long, bitter winter. He never forgot Sarah. He never meant to. But what Eleanor gave him wasn't replacement. It was redemption. A second chance, not at justice, but at living. And as the sun broke over the rooftops, one morning casting long, golden rays across the porch, where Thaddius drank his coffee, he realized something simple, but profound. He was no longer a ghost. He was a man who had chosen finally to live again. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that healing can come, even after decades of silence, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And don't miss the next tale we have for you, a grieving father, a missing daughter, and a truth buried beneath the snow for 15 years. Click now to watch it and see how one man's loss uncovered a town's darkest secret.